Hello. With all the talk lately about JD Vance and his nomination as the vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, I just was really intrigued by his story because he went to Yale Law School and I did too. And so I decided to go ahead and read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, and I found it really fascinating. And I just wanted to kind of talk about my experience at Yale Law School and how, why it is that I don't know exactly why, but for some reason he and I went in completely opposite directions. um, he talks about, he got into Yale. It was very impressive. He got into Yale because he was really like at the top of his class at Ohio State, and he graduated in just 2 years. So that's really, really impressive. I also went to a state school, and they kind of make jokes in the book about state schools and how some people at Yale don't respect state schools as much as the Ivy League schools. I went to UC Berkeley in California, and so that I know that's not quite the same as some other state schools. It has a really good reputation compared to some other state schools. So, when I say I went to a state school, I know it's a little bit different. But anyway, so I did go to a state school. It took me 5 years to graduate, not two like him. And I was not wealthy. I probably was more financially secure. My family was more financially secure than his was, I'm guessing from what he wrote about in his book, but definitely not wealthy. So I decided to go to law school because I really wanted to make the world a better place. And I thought, if I get a law degree, I'll have so many options of what I can do. And I wasn't quite ready to, quote unquote, go out into the real world and get a job. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go to law school. So I had worked really hard at UC Berkeley, and to be honest, I had purposely tried really hard to maintain a high, in fact, a perfect GPA. And I didn't always do that in ways that I'm super proud of. I maintained a perfect GPA by avoiding difficult classes, or if there was a difficult class that I wanted to take, I would take it pass fail. But I just was really obsessive about getting straight A's, because that is kind of how I grew up with that message that straight A's are really, really important. So I got straight A's at Berkeley, and I'm really a good test taker, so I did really well in the LSAT. And so I did get into every law school I applied to, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, etc. And I chose Yale for a few reasons. One, because at the time it was rated as the best law school in the country. And I really wanted to be able to say, I got into the best law school in the country and be able to prove it, which again is sad. I was kind of raised with the desire to show achievement, show proof of achievement. And also it had a reputation of being not so hardcore as other law schools, like a little bit friendlier. Supposedly they don't have grades. And I liked that because I was really shy and unconfident, and I was terrified of going to a more, cutthroat school like Harvard, where, you hear all these stories about, there was even a whole show on TV for a while about how scary that school is and how your professors call on you and embarrass you and stuff. So that's how I chose Yale. And so I went much earlier than JD did. I graduated in 95, and I think he graduated maybe at least 10 years after that. So I know it's a little different, although I don't think that much has changed. Some things he talks about in the book definitely were familiar to me. So the first semester at Yale Law School, I went there kind of thinking, oh, this is an education. I'm going to learn things, but I found out very quickly that a lot of the people who went there did a lot of preparation. Like they almost took, their own pre-law school studies before they went to law school so that they could be really well prepared, which was super smart because the way they taught was not your typical way of teaching. Their pedagogical methods were, I think, left a lot to be desired. I mean, some of the teachers were really good, but kind of the traditional way of teaching law school, as you might have heard, is the Socratic method, where you have to read all these things. So usually you're reading these cases, these really old cases. You don't even understand half the words in the cases. And then the professor asks you questions, and you don't even have any context to what it's even about. So I just remember, like, we had to take contract law our first semester, and I didn't really know what a contract was. And so, they were asking all these questions about these cases, but I didn't have the most basic knowledge to even understand what a contract was. And I found out later that a lot of my classmates who maybe had, friends or family that had gone to law school, they were like, oh, read this book first, learn all about the basics so that you understand the classes a little bit better. And I really wish I had done that, because in most of my classes, probably all my classes in my first semester, I was very terrified. I did not understand a lot of what was going on. I couldn't keep up with the reading. And I did get called on, and, I always tried to avoid getting called on, but I did get called on in one of my classes, the torts class, and I really didn't know the answer, and it was really, really embarrassing. So it is a scary transition to go to law school when you're, after college, where, in college, oftentimes you're able to select classes that have really good professors and there's a lot of support. And in law school, it just kind of feels like you're thrown in the deep end. And if you don't understand what's going on, too bad, So that's kind of how my first year was. One thing that JD talks about in his book is going for the law journal. So I had totally forgotten about that. So it's this thing where you're supposed to try to get on the law journal. And it's this process where you have to compete by doing some kind of writing exercise or something to get on the law journal. And it's almost like expected that everyone do it. And there's this idea that you can't get a good job unless you're on the law journal. Well, back then I had already realized that I probably didn't want to go work for a big law firm, that I wanted to do something in the public interest. And so I did not go for the law journal. I didn't try to get on the law journal. And I remember feeling kind of weird because almost everyone I knew was going for it. And, part of me felt kind of superior in a way, because I was like, oh, you're just in this rat race and you're just doing what everyone else is doing. But at the same time, I kind of felt like, oh my God, am I making a mistake? And I'm definitely glad I didn't go for the law journal, because if you do get on the law journal, all you end up having, the thing that's so prestigious, you have to edit articles for the journal, which is very boring. It's like a lot of checking to make sure the citations are correct and things like that. So I'm really glad I did not get on the law journal or even try to. JD says he didn't get on when he first tried, but he did get on his second year when he tried again. Let's see what else. So when I was in law school, I thought I would probably be like a civil rights advocate, litigator. I would go to court and do impact litigation and save the world that way. And so I took a lot of civil rights classes, and luckily some of them were really, really good. But I also really wanted to get practical experience. So I spent a lot of time in the clinic, where we actually got to represent clients in various types of matters, like landlord-tenant cases related to benefits. I remember I even had a case where someone was suing a rent-to-own store because they were very exploitive. So that was super fun. I did realize, though, that I did not like litigation, because it just felt so stressful, and it felt like it doesn't really go to the root of the problem. Oftentimes, if your client is someone who's poor or who has experienced an injustice, you might be able to litigate on their behalf and maybe even win for them, but it often just doesn't solve the underlying issue, which is usually poverty. So I became really passionate about wanting to do stuff that would go to the root of the problem, which I saw and still see as poverty and wealth inequality. So I ended up focusing more on community economic development, which is kind of, you could almost call it like corporate law for nonprofits, where you're using your legal tools to help nonprofits that are supporting communities to do all kinds of projects that make the community healthier, safer, more financially, more economically thriving. So I did that. And we did have some clinics at Yale, which was nice, that focused on that type of work. And at one point, I was so enjoying doing that type of work that I wanted to do this thing they had, which I can't remember what it was called. But there was this way you could actually take a semester off of law school and go work in a community, or do some kind of an internship, and you'd get full credit. And so I ended up finding this nonprofit in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is a very low income city, where I was going to do grassroots community organizing. And I was so excited, and I applied for it and I was rejected. And I remember the professor who was in charge of the decision said to me, "Jenny, you need to focus more on the art before you can start working on the craft." And I was like, oh my God, that is such bullshit, because most of the stuff we learned in law school was so not useful. I mean, he called it art. I called it a waste of time because it was just such arcane knowledge that you would never use as a practicing attorney, very theoretical. So that really frustrated me. But anyway, I continued with law school. I actually ended up taking 4 semesters of Spanish in the undergraduate school. I was amazed that they let me do that, but that was great. It was such a good program, and I learned so much Spanish. I was like almost fluent after law school. So let's see, what else did I want to talk about? In terms of summer jobs, so JD talks about this in his book, how what happens with summer jobs is there's this hotel that's basically almost across the street from the law school. And all these big, like the biggest, most kind of corporate white shoe law firms that exist in the country and probably even in the world, they set up shop there, and you go there and you talk to them, and there's like this whole process you go through, and they make different cuts, and eventually you get a summer job at a law firm. And then oftentimes that summer job will maybe lead to another summer job your second summer, and then it'll lead to a full, a regular job at the end of law school. And, so many Yale law students start out law school saying, oh, I don't know if I want to even be a lawyer at all. And if I am, I want to work in the public interest. But a huge majority of my class, I don't know the actual number, but a huge majority did end up going to work for big law firms, because they make it so easy. Not that I never did it myself, but the interview process, I'm sure, is stressful. But I mean, they're right across the street. The law school makes it so easy for you. They set up your whole schedule for you. It's just such a feeder to get people to go and work at big law firms. And of course, they pay really well. So it's very, very attractive for folks. And I'll admit, I did not have the same level of financial need as JD says he did in his book. So I had more options. The law school did have some really good programs for people like me who weren't we didn't get financial aid because we didn't have that level of need, but we're not wealthy. So there were some fellowships that I was able to take advantage of to pay me to go work in public interest jobs over the summer. So my first summer I worked at California Rural Legal Assistance, and then my second summer I worked at Texas Rural Legal Aid. And they didn't pay me anything, those nonprofits, but the law school actually did give me a stipend for working there. So that was great. But of course, it was nowhere near what you could make as a summer associate at a big giant law firm, corporate law firm. So JD, of course, did end up going to a big corporate law firm. Another thing that is really popular to do is a clerkship, and that's where you go and work for a judge after law school. And, some people are really angling to get, there are these judges called feeder judges, which I think he talks about in the book, where these are judges where if you clerk with them, you have a good chance of the following year going to clerk on the Supreme Court. So a lot of people angle for that, and it's very competitive and a huge process. So I didn't participate in any of that. I actually, when I was a first year at Yale Law School, Van Jones was there, and Van Jones now is famous. A lot of people know who he is, but he was my age. He was a third year and I was a first year, but we were the same age. And he was kind of the leader in some way, a leader of the students that were more progressive and wanted to do something good for the world and not just go work for a big corporate law firm. And so because he was a third year when I was a first year, he was very vocal. We had this thing called the wall, and it's funny because now the wall is a digital thing, but back then it was a literal wall because we didn't have the internet back then. And you would write things on the wall and people would stand there and read it. And Van would write all these things on the wall saying, you don't have to go across the street and go work for a big corporate law firm. Don't do it, and that made me feel a lot better about my choice not to go do that. So I never did go work for a big corporate law firm, and I'm really glad. Yes, I would be super wealthy now, but probably miserable. And I also never went for a clerkship because, I wanted to go out into the world and make a difference. So JD, from what I understand, I think his first job out of law school was maybe for a senator, and then he did a clerkship, and then he went and worked for a big law firm. So he kind of took more of a traditional path than I did, for sure. And then he went, and as many people know, at some point he decided to go work in Silicon Valley in the VC world, the venture capital world. And I just find that really funny because my path has been to help mission-driven entrepreneurs and underrepresented entrepreneurs raise capital outside of the venture capital model. So I've been doing that since 2006 after I worked at a nonprofit for 11 years after law school. And my clients have raised millions and millions of dollars using the non-VC model. And I think from what I understand, his VC career was not all that successful. So, and I'm not saying all my clients have been successful. I have had some clients that have gone out of business, but I'm really proud of how many clients I've had that are highly mission-driven businesses, have raised hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars from investors and have been really successful. And it's been a win-win-win for their investors, their businesses, their communities, the environment, their employees. One example of that I was thinking about recently is Equal Exchange, which is just a wonderful business that has raised a lot of money over the years. I just recently helped them raise a little bit more using investment crowdfunding. And their investors love them. They have hundreds of investors, and they are the opposite of a venture capital backed company. They actually have written into their articles of incorporation that they will never sell out and have a quote unquote exit. So anyway, these are just all things I thought about when thinking about JD Vance and reading his book. One of the things he says at the very beginning of his book is, the coolest thing I have ever done is go to Yale Law School. And of course, his book is a little old now. I think it's almost 10 years old, maybe 8 years old. So I'm sure he would say he's done other cool things since then, but I just thought that was funny because, I don't talk a lot about the fact that I went to Yale Law School. Honestly, it hasn't had a huge impact on my life. I didn't really stay friends with any of my classmates, so I didn't get the benefits that some people get by staying connected with these people who become incredibly high-powered people. I somewhat regret that, but I didn't love law school. I felt like it did become such a feeder for people to go into corporate law and use their talents and skills to help big corporations get richer and screw over their workers and their investors, etc. So I just really wanted to wash my hands of the whole thing when I got out of there. So yeah, Anyway, just some stuff I was thinking about. Oh, and another thing I will say is that another funny thing about Yale Law School is that by the time you're in your third year of law school, even toward the very beginning, most people already know what they're going to do, because a lot of people, they either go through that clerkship process where they get, they get chosen fairly early in the year for a clerkship, or they already have an offer from a law firm like really early in the year. And I remember in my third year, I was kind of panicking because I had no idea what I was going to do. There are a bunch of programs you can apply for where you can get kind of grants and funding to go work at a nonprofit after law school, but I didn't get any of those, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I knew I loved community economic development. I knew I wanted to come back to the San Francisco Bay Area. And lucky for me, I was sitting in the clinic, where I often was, and, representing clients in the clinic. I spent a lot of my time there. And someone was walking by me, and I overheard them say, "Hey, have you heard you can use a National Science Foundation fellowship to get a master's degree in city planning?" And I was like, that's really interesting. And I looked into it, and sure enough, you could get this pretty nice fellowship to go get a master's in city planning. And I had already become really interested in community economic development, and a lot of people who did that work had master's degrees in city planning. Not many of them actually had law degrees. So I was like, I'm going to go for that. So thank goodness I applied for that fellowship. I got it. So it allowed me to come back to the Bay Area. It gave me 3 years of funding, not a lot, but enough funding to live on, and get that master's degree. And that's how I ended up finding this wonderful nonprofit where I ended up working for 11 years doing community economic development. And I ended up working with a lot of small businesses, and that's how I got so passionate about helping small businesses get access to supportive capital. So I feel really, really lucky, and I feel really sad that, JD, he says he felt very out of sorts and out of place at Yale Law School. And a lot of my classmates are writing on Facebook right now about how that's probably not really true. Because it is, I don't know. I have mixed feelings. Some people are like, I never felt that way, but I did sometimes. I did feel like there was some, ostentatiousness, and people are headed on this path to be seen as like the most brilliant people in the world, going to the most prestigious law firms, making, tons of money. So I can kind of relate to what he said about that. But he ended up really going for jobs that made him incredibly very much so a part of the elite, the high-paying white shoe law firm and the prestigious clerkship. So I'm really glad I did not go in that direction, and I hope he does not become our vice president. I think it's, listening to what he's saying now compared to what he was saying in the book, he's, not that I agreed with some of the things he said in the book, but it's really scary how full of hate and judgmentalism he is now. So anyway, thank you so much for listening. I really enjoyed being able to walk down memory lane.